Hi, hello everybody. Oh wow, I can hear an echo of my own voice. Welcome to all of you wearers that are joining us today in this, which is our last event of 2021. We're wrapping up the year with this event, and it's going to be a very special one. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Nao. And you can see in your screens Vanessa as well. We are co-founders of Wearers Festival. And for those of you who don't know yet, Wearers Festival is a multidisciplinary London-based platform dedicated to explore and celebrate all the meanings of dress and the relationship between people and their clothes, and the relationships between clothes and culture and identity. So we are very excited to have you all here today. We're very excited to have Rico, who Vanessa is going to introduce to all of us in a second. Thank you so much, Joe. And just before starting, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, just for all of you to be aware of. So I'm going to read you our events protocol now. Wearers Festival facilitates spaces for individuals to come together and join conversations about the meanings of dress. The organization is not responsible for the personal opinions of the guest speakers expressed before, during, or after the session, and this may or may not reflect the views of the organization. We invite our attendees to engage in the conversation during the event using the chat or using your hand with the Zoom function and turning your microphones off during the second part of the session. Sorry, turning them on during the second part of the session. Until then, we kindly ask you all to keep your cameras and microphones disabled. Wearers Festival is compiled to declare that no abusive behavior against our guest speakers or other members of the public will be tolerated, and that anyone incurring in these practices will be automatically removed from the session. We remind you that this event is being recorded and may be uploaded in Wearers Festival's platforms in order to offer accessibility to those who didn't have the opportunity to attend today. That's it. And just before passing the microphone to Vanessa, I want to remind you all quickly to follow us in our social media, Wearers Festival, and our website is wearersfestival.com, where you can stay tuned for our future events and activities. So that's all on my side. Vanessa, microphone is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Rico. If you can turn your camera on so everyone can see your face while I read your bio. There we go. So Arturo Rico, journalist and researcher, former fashion PR executive, writer, and experimental photographer, is founder of Ficheraz, a digital archive project dedicated to preserve the legacy of vintage showgirls from Latin America, the Caribbean, the diaspora, and beyond. Ficheraz is a digital archive project dedicated to the preservation and promotion of the legacy of vedettes from Latin America, the Caribbean, and the diaspora during the 20th century. The project started in 2018 and has since gained international notoriety. 130,000 followers on Instagram and 371,000 on Facebook echo the popularity of this project, which has also caught the attention of figures such as Diane Pernette, Kim Kardashian, Dita Von Teese, and Kali Uchis, just to name a few. Ficheraz's work has been linked to cultural institutions such as Google Arts and Culture, Mexico's National Audio Library, I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly, the Estanquilo Museum in Mexico City, and ASVOF. So that is an exciting resume and an incredible project that you're working on, which is why we're all here today and we're excited to hear about. But before I give you the mic, I want to ask you something that we ask all of our guest speakers, which is, what are you wearing today and why?
Well, I'm just wearing a hoodie because I usually work on my office, but right now I'm on my home office, so I just wear something. So it's
the comfy home office look.
Comfortable, yeah. Sorry, I'm not dressed up like you guys.
No, everybody is fashionable no matter what. And that's what you feel comfortable in, and that's important. So I'm going to leave the mic to you, and Naomi's going to give you access so that we can start the presentation. Enjoy, everyone.
Okay. Perfect. So everybody here, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Just Nessa and now, please confirm if you can see it when I share it, and then I'll go on with it. Wait a minute. Presentation.
We can see your screen now.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much to everyone who joined this. I'm so excited to do this. I have done this kind of presentations before, but for Mexican audiences, for Hispanic audiences, and this is the first time I'm doing one in English. And of course, it's not only the fact that it is in English, but is the fact that you can share it with a wider audience, because most people who are on social media, and most of my followers are English speakers. So I'm so excited for this. So this is the presentations for Stilettos and Glitter, the fashion legacy of Latin American showgirls. As they stated, this is a project I started a couple of years ago, Ficheraz, and I'm really interested in research of this type of performers. Obviously, Latin America with an emphasis, but the showgirl phenomenon in general, and it's really interesting because it touches topics such as art, cinema, music, fashion, beauty. It's related to politics as well, so it's not something minimal, it's something global, and I think that's why it has grown a lot of interest in me. So just to start, we're going to try to define what does it mean to be a showgirl, right? So most of you, or I don't know, the majority of the people who are interested in the topic may know Dita Von Teese. So when you think of showgirls, probably she's the one who comes to mind. For those who don't know her, she is a she's a burlesque performer, an American burlesque performer, and she is the modern embodiment of 50s glamour. She's really inspired by Hollywood, by 50s showgirls and the cabaret scene of that era, from pinups and all that. As I know, a lot of people here are from the UK, so maybe a lot of you guys know Immodesty Blaze, who is also a burlesque performer but she is from the UK, and she currently lives in Monaco, I guess. And she's also inspired by the glamour of vintage cabarets and stuff like that. Another idea that we may or may not have from showgirls is the Parisian showgirls and the Las Vegas showgirls, which is the stereotypical idea one has of showgirls. Picture here is Mitener, who won Miss Universe, I think, in 2018, and then went on to pursue a career as a showgirl. She worked at the Latin Quartier, I guess is the name of the cabaret in Paris. Or for some, belly dancers are kind of a version of what showgirl or is or means, but this is debatable. But are the images that we would think of, or generally people think of when they think about showgirls. But what's really interesting is that in Latin America, the showgirl genre is this and more. So it varies, in race, in styles, in rhythms. It has also parts of burlesque. It has also parts of classical cabaret, but it has its own, rhythms and ideas. So that's why I think it's important to shine light not only on the showgirl phenomenon, but in the Latin showgirl phenomenon. Sorry, I have a puppy here. He's making a mess. So that's what we're going to talk about on today, about the legacy and the history of Latin American showgirls. So this is a definition I've seen. I compose from different definitions of what showgirl is or maybe. So in Western art, it's all about aesthetic. It's not so much about feelings or meanings or sentiments. It's about the expression and the lines and the aesthetic, like ballet, right? So in that idea, following that concept, showgirls will be the epitome of Western art because they are performers who use, their poise and their grace to entertain the audiences. Another words to describe what a showgirl do, or the showgirl performer idea, is vedette, which is commonly used in Hispanic speaking countries, showwoman, or menus de revue, which is the French version of it. And this title was only given to performers who could command, the attention of the audience from start to finish of a spectacle without doing that much. That's, a general definition of what a showgirl could be, but I like to define it as a female entertainer or a female presenting entertainment, because there are a lot of queer entertainers or even drag queens who identify as male but perform as female, who work as showgirls. Well, it's a female entertainer who makes use of her charisma, looks, props, and costumes to entertain an audience. I didn't include anything related to the type of show they do, because they can work on theater, they can work on cinema, they can work on cabarets. I didn't add anything about dancer, because not all showgirls are dancers. For instance, Dira Bontis, it's a trained ballerina, a ballet ballerina, but she doesn't dance on her shows. And some showgirls don't even do, physical stuff there. Some sing, some are models. So this is a global definition of what I would call a showgirl. Someone who doesn't need, uh, artistic talent or theatrical talent to 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 entertain. It's all about an illusion. So that's why they use looks, props, and costumes. So let's get right into it in the history of Latin American showgirls. Okay, so obviously, when talking about Latin America, it's almost impossible to not mention Europe. Because most of our traditions we got them from them, and showgirl being an European phenomenon, or genre, or whatever you want to call it, uh, was brought here because I'm in Mexico, that's why I say here, was brought here by Europeans. So in the case of Latin America, because most of the countries in Latin America are Spanish speaking, it comes the global idea of showgirl came from Spain. So we have to look back at the history of Spain. So in the mid 19th century, Spain lived its civil war, and I like to include images of women fighting in the civil war of Spain. And every time there is like a war, like conflict, this turns into the people of the country, into really patriotic values, into really nationalist view of what it means to belong to that country. That's why Americans have such patriotism, because it's a permanent state of why they should fight for it. So this war, in the civil wars of Spain, after it ended, it let them discover their identity as Spaniards, and they rediscover in this period in an art form called zarzuela. Zarzuela is one of the most antique artistic expressions of Spain, and basically it's Spain's version of opera, but it has a lot of influences from um, even from cultures such as the Gitano culture, which is um, as old as Spain itself. So they rediscovered this art from zarzuela, and in 1856 they opened the Teatro de Zarzuela in Madrid, the Zarzuela Theater, and they give this art from a revival. So obviously, this was only for the rich and the cultured, and and they created an entire system around it. It was not just the Zarzuela theater at first. It was also they opened a lot of theaters as well, and they were all doing zarzuelas, and which were, as I mentioned, operas. And so only the elite had access to this type of shows, and the elite being the royals, the rich, the diplomats, and the masses, who ironically are the minority, the working class, um, couldn't access this type of shows. So another genre was created for them, and it was, a mock on opera, so it was called operetta, and these were, the the ordinary, or the less cultured version of them, because operas and zarzuelas were all about, uh, complex topics and Greek mythology and stuff like that, and operettas were about everyday stuff and about the stuff that the majority of the people know. So, for instance, biblical stuff, or the political climate of the time, without going into detail. And so the masses, the working class, was really in awe of these type of shows. So operettas were musical spectacles with an imaginary and crazy plot, and they consisted of spoken word dialogues, among which there were comedic sketches called couplets and dances such as the can. So it was very 19th century style. The topics, as I mentioned, the topics addressed in operettas were common and superficial, and those attending such shows did not need to add a great cultural knowledge to enjoy them. So I wanted to include this because um, the impact that Showgirls had in our culture, in our perception here in America, of beauty, of fashion, of music, of entertainment, it was huge. And it is because since the very beginning of the genre, it had, it was very close to the masses. It wasn't exclusive, for instance, or for saying. So um, if operetta entertained the rich with dramatic plots, virtuous singers, and large orchestras, if opera, I mean, operettas amuse the poor with comedy sketches, flashy dances, and costumes, and of course, beautiful women. So, they didn't need to put on such great spectacles to entertain, the masses, and that's what made operettas really popular back in the day. So the stars of the operetta were initially dubbed as coupletistas because they performed couplets. I mentioned couplets, as previously stated, where short stories with really comical plots, but they were told in verses, and the showgirls could sing them. So the coupletistas were revolutionary women who made use of their beauty and their great personalities to entertain the masses. They sang in a very high-pitched voice known as tiple. How we have soprano, there's also a type of voice known as tiple, and most of these women had that type of voice, which is very high-pitched, almost kind of annoying, but it gave the part for a very comedic piece. And later, by the turn of the century, and starting the 20th century, they were no longer called coupletistas, but they were called tiples in general. So we have here some images of Spanish showgirls or tiples who work during this period. So records date the arrival of Spanish tiples in Latin America as early as the 1890. So that year, for example, Prudencia Grifel arrived in Caracas, Venezuela, Maria Conesa arrived in Mexico City, and in 1915, Carmen Lama settled in Buenos Aires. These showgirls all came from Spain, and they had, this operetta tradition, and they had these high-pitched tiple voices. And so they installed in Latin America the same style of entertainment that they had in Spain. So that's basically I mean, these and others, obviously, like Gloria Guzman and Maria Turgenova, were, the very, very first showgirls in Latin America, even though they come from Spain. The arrival of the Spanish tiples developed a very primitive idea of what the concept of Latin American showgirls would be. So now we have here on the left, we have photos of three Mexican showgirls born and raised in Mexico, who took some inspiration from their Spanish influences, but I mean you can still see them as really European or in the fashion of the time. On the right we have a photo of rich Mexican women in 1901. So very Victorian, Edwardian style of fashion, and the Showgirls were doing it the same, right? So we can say that yet that the Showgirls in Latin America could be different from the European ones, but it's a process. Operettas were classified as género chico, smaller genre. The género chico was characterized by its short duration, 1 hour or less, the insignificance of the content, and the simplicity of its plot. With few characters and a single setting, its subject matter tends to be mostly costumbrista. Costumbrista, I don't know if there's an English translation, I bet it is, but it's, a type of art of expression that resembles or copies everything that's happening in everyday life, like going to the park or buying stuff or cooking. So the plots were really simple. Also, part of the género chico was the revista, which has, I don't know if it's in English as well, but in French they're called review. And revistas are dramatic. It's a dramatic subgenre of the comedy that unfolds in a type of show that combines music, dance, and many times also brief scenes or humorous or satirical sketches. The reviews combine dramatic elements of burlesque, vaudeville, extravaganza, and musical comedy, but it's distinguished from all of them by the erotic charge in dramatic simplicity. So again, it's something similar to the zarzuela, digo, I mean to the operetta, but this is more theatrical and more musical, while operetta is more, sort of like sketches. This is more related to musical theater. So those two genres arrive in Latin America and the first countries to have, this kind of system were Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Cuba. So I think it's well distributed. It takes on, different geographical regions and also, um, different languages and cultures. So let's keep in mind that we have in Latin America we have now operetta and we have revista, right? So as I mentioned before, with the Spanish Civil War, it awakens these nationalist values, and the same happened in Mexico in the 1910s because we had the Mexican Revolution here as well. So the Civil War, for instance. So the Mexican Revolution was one of the first events that made the showgirls concept stop looking to Europe and adopt elements of our identity as Latin Americans. Mexican showgirls were extremely famous at that time, and since the Civil War was, um, so from the 1910s onwards, they were the ones who started to spread this new idea of Latinidad or Latinity or Latin identity based on folkloric values throughout the continent. Picture here on the right are two Mexican female soldiers, and they are known or referred to as Adelitas because there is this type of music here in Mexico called corridos, and corridos tell stories, and they started in the revolution. And there's one called the Adelita. Adelita is a cute form to call someone named Adela, and it's a story about a soldier named Adela who fought again along the generals. And so all the female soldiers were called Adelitas at this point. So as you can see, they had these distinguishable Mexican type of costumes, and they fall like that because they were not rich women. Most of the people who fight on the revolution were from the province, from the towns. Most some of them were of indigenous ancestry. So these were the clothing they wore on their everyday life, minus the guns. Um, and so even though they were from the province, the revolution happened in the big cities. So of course the showgirls were exposed to all of this. That's why I put these images. This photo is a photo of Mexico City during the revolution, and you can see, I don't know if you can see this image clearly, but standing between the horse and the guy who is walking with a big hat is a there's a male dressed in, very typical Edwardian or Victorian clothing, from the 1910s. So it's really interesting to see the contrast between, what the soldiers of the revolution were wearing to, everyday life. So, for instance, we have on the horses the men who are wearing, typical charro garments, but walking along them are, men with the sarape, which is, something really folkloric of our identity as Mexicans. Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata were, the leaders of the revolution, and I picture them here just so you guys can see what also the, through their to their clothes, what they were kind of representing. And they they were really interesting because they had relationships with the showgirls, some as fans, some as lovers. So it was, showgirls have always been really related to politics, and it was no exception. Also, here picture in this photo, it's from 1911. You can see two rich Mexican women. We call them Catrinas, walking like nothing's happening while the revolution is happening back behind them. So you see the dresses they are wearing are the dresses that the showgirls were wearing at the beginning of the presentation, right? So like very very Edwardian or Belle Epoque kind of shape and materials. So when the revolution happened, showgirls stopped wearing this type of costumes, very, elegant or fancy dresses. They started adopting elements of the Mexican identity that happened here in Mexico. So we have Maria Conesa here. She's pictured here, right? And then she's wearing a China Poblana dress, which is the typical costume here in Mexico of a state named Puebla. And then she's wearing the Tehuana costume, which is the folkloric garments of the state of Oaxaca. Esperanza Iris was Spanish. She was Spanish born and came with the first generation of showgirls from Spain to Mexico. And though this may seem, as cultural appropriation nowadays because she wasn't Mexican and she was white, and most of this clothing were worn by women of Native American ancestry, it wasn't because, as I mentioned before, the work of the showgirls was to represent what was happening in society at the time. So if literally, as we see in these photos, the revolution is happening amidst everyday life, amidst women walking in their elegant costumes, of course they are going to represent that on the theater. And for instance, Maria Conesa has really interesting stories about how Pancho Villa took over Mexico City, the capital of the country, and there was a rumor that he wanted to kidnap her, and so she stayed living in the theater for like 3 or 4 months until they left. And she says that she used, the props of the play they were going for as her furniture because she didn't have furniture there, and she used the costumes as her everyday clothes because she couldn't leave the theater because she was scared that he may or may not kidnap her. And there's a really interesting interview of her, in her older years, where she recalls that another troop of soldiers took over the theater, and they literally asked her to perform for them. And she thought, well, my shows are for families. They come with kids, for couples. They're going to throw tomatoes at me if I do this kind of show for a horde of men. So she switched the script, and she dared to go off stage and sat on the laps of the soldiers, for comedic purpose. And she acted like she was into the soldiers, and she sat on one of the soldiers' laps, and she took some scissors of her bra, and she cut the mustache of these men. And when she did that, she just got one side of it. The entire theater went like, oh my god, what did she did? And he was a general. So the show finished, she went onto her dressing room, and and she says that they knocked the door, and she was like, okay, they're gonna kill me. So they opened the door, and it was, the general of that army, and he kindly asked her, can you cut the other half just to make it even? So the revolution not only changed the type of costume they were wearing, but they also changed the show completely, because they had to represent now the quotidianity, or the things that were happening in regular basis, were wars on the street. So they had to change and adapt this type of shows to the theater. So of course it changed a lot. So for those who don't know, the Mexican flag has an eagle on it, and for instance, Mimiderva here, picture left, was literally wearing an eagle costume. um, Here in the middle, I think it's a photo of the 100 years of the independence from Spain, and picture right, it's Emma Duval also in very folkloric style costumes here. But these were all for the theater. And at the same time, it started getting riskier without the introduction of cabaret, because showgirls of this era didn't know what cabaret was. They just knew revista and they knew operetta. So they didn't knew burlesque, they didn't knew cabaret yet, but they had to put on shows that were more erotic or riskier for the troops. And they seemed to like it because they continued to do it after the war ended. So the Mexican showgirls toured Latin America and Europe, bringing the flavor of national folklore to every place they perform. From Argentina to Cuba, Latin showgirls began to adapt design elements associated with Mexican aesthetics, which evolved into the discovery of their own national identities. So, picture here are three showgirls, and they are not Mexican, neither of them. And these are, I believe, Argentina, and I think Lucian is from Venezuela, and they are all wearing these kind of traditional costumes. So it's interesting to see how they adopted the idea of Mexican values or Latin values, and then translate it to costumes for the theater. Another interesting story from here is that the most important theater here in Mexico, it's called the Esperanza Theater, and she's pictured here. Let me go back a few slides. Here on the right, on the left, I mean. And Esperanza Iris was a showgirl who worked alongside all of them. And during the revolution, she escaped Mexico because it weren't easy times, and she went on to work in Spain, in Cuba, in Peru, in Brazil, and in Argentina. And while she was, working there, she sent all her earnings by train here to Mexico City to build her theater. So, I mean, they didn't have, such easy access to cameras back then. Obviously, telephone communications were still developing. Of course, they didn't have cell phones. So she wasn't aware that her theater was being built, but she trusted the process. And when she came back, she had, I think the Esperanza Iris Theater is, one of the very big theaters in Latin America. So, this cultural exchange happened throughout the decades of the 1910s and onwards until the early 1920s. And so by the time the art of cabaret was brought to Latin America by the famous Parisian cabaret, the Bataclan. For those who don't know, the Bataclan is like the Moulin Rouge, like the Crazy Horse, like the Lido de Paris. It's top 10 most famous cabarets in the world. And it was run by a showgirl called Madame Razimi, who literally came to Latin America and changed our perception of what showgirls should or could be. So she arrived in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1922, and that same year she presented the first nude dancers in the history, completely nude. So initially the show was highly criticized, but later it was so appreciated that all the showgirls on the continent stopped being called tiples. They went from being cupletistas to tiples, and they were now called bataclanas because Bataclana means the one who works at the Bataclan. So from Mexico, which is, the northest country in Latin America, to Argentina, which is the southest country in Latin America. Showgirls all over Latin America and the Caribbean were known as Bataclanas because of her. So we have here some images of what the Bataclan showgirls were wearing when they arrived here. Apart from being naked on some parts of the performance, they were these, I which we understand more as showgirl costumes, right? The feather headdress, the ruffles, the tights. So that's what Madame Razini brought to here to Mexico. Sorry for the noise. I live near downtown Mexico City. Um, so she obviously revolutionized the idea of showgirls with these costumes and the shows they could put on with this type of costumes. So, and she also brought, the fashion of Europe to Latin America. So, for instance, for those who know about fashion, Lanvin had created the Robe de Style, which is, this structure skirt, and Paul Poiret had, all these Orientalist influences, and of course the Russian ballets had also this Orientalist inspiration, and indirectly, Madame Razimi and the Bataclan brought all of that to Latin America. So we have photos of Latin American showgirls. And look at it, just notice how in a couple of years, the picture on the right is from 1923 and the revolution ended almost in 1920. So look how fast they adopted these new styles that talk, really avant-garde and fashion-forward languages. And they were costumes for the theater because the rich women in Mexico were not wearing any of this, and the rich women in Argentina were not wearing any of this either. They were more into the flapper style clothing, and this goes beyond that. So I have here some photos of what everyday women were wearing in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, and then what was displayed in the theaters, in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. So you can notice there's a huge difference on the simplicity. And of course, this is not a fair comparison because obviously theater costumes will always be 10 times bigger and louder and exaggerated. But when studying Latin American fashion, one just don't simply see that something that Lamban was doing or Paul Poiret was doing could have a direct effect on what women were seeing, because even if the women picture here were not wearing these outfits, they were getting the references from them because they went to the theaters. So it's really interesting to point this out. So in the concept and or in the construction of the idea of Latin showgirls, we have the influence of opereta, of course, which came from the Spanish opera zarzuela. And then we have the cabaret that was brought by Madame Razini in the Bataclan. And then we have the revista as well, which was part of the Género Chico, which had vaudeville influences, extravagance influences, and burlesque influences. Burlesque, for those who don't know or may not know, was not only about striptease. So back in the day, burlesque, if there are some Spanish speaking people here, or maybe Italian and French speaking people here, Portuguese, um, languages that come from Latin, burlesque is really easy to understand for us because it's kind of translate as mockable or something you can make fun of. So burlesque was initially all about satire and this type of really really dark comedy or dark humor. And the actual definition of burlesque is to praise what is not considered moral. So of course, by this definition, we can understand why striptease is part of burlesque. But not only striptease was, travesti, which is, where drag comes from, was also part of burlesque. So, the act of wearing clothes of the opposite gender in this period of time was completely immoral. So, eh, for instance, we have the Rocky Twins or Barbette, who were extremely successful drag queens back in the 1920s or in the early 20th century uh, were part of burlesque, this classification of travesty, which, by the way, Barbette, who is pictured sitting here, um, was the one who advised Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe in the movie Some Like It Hot, where they dressed as female. So just that's just a fun fact. And Latin showgirls were doing it as well. Celia Gomez, which is an Argentinian-born showgirl who went on to work in Spain during the early 20th century, was the first Hispanic female entertainer to do a drag or to cross dress into the other gender. And she performed as El Pichi, which El Pichi means, well, it doesn't mean anything, but it's, an archetype of what, um, the common Spanish, a guy from, a young guy from that era will be. And it was, it really exalted values that today wouldn't be acceptable, and it was a really misogynist character, and it talk about violence against women, and it talk about abusing their power to obtain earnings and stuff like that. But it wasn't controversial because that was the point of burlesque, as I mentioned, to praise what was not morally accepted or morally viewed as positive. So, and of course, it being performed by a woman, it's completely ironic. So Celia Gomez was the first to do so. The play or the revista in which she did this number was Las Leandras in 1931. And for in the history of Latin American entertainment or Hispanic entertainment, this is a very important uh, play or script because it was later represented by figures like Rocio Durcal, who was extremely popular in Spain and in Latin America. Sara Montiel, Paloma San Basilio, and tons of actresses have recreated this play, and of course the number of El Pichi, where the women dress as men, is completely revolutionary for the time. So let me have a sip of water. As we have seen here, we have that the showgirls were the first to look after our values in Latin America, through their costumes. They were really rebelling, and they really play with gender roles, as in completely going into drag as male and into femininity, and to being completely sexy and what we understand today as hyper femme, right? But remember that at the beginning of the conversation, I told you that I like to define showgirls as entertainers who use props and costumes to entertain the audiences. Well, that's basically it. You can a prop is also being completely naked or having just a few things showing. So it's really interesting to see how they build most of their careers on these type of elements and tricks and props and stunts. Um, Simultaneously, in Rio de Janeiro, the first representation of what we understand today as carnival costumes began to appear. Although the concept of carnival has existed in Latin America since colonial times, it was in the 1930s that it began to transform into what we know today as showgirl costumes from the carnival. First in Brazil, and from there to the rest of the world. This photo here, it's really interesting because it's from 1933. So, it's a group of girls. They are all and teenagers, I guess. And they are all dressed in these cute costumes. Of course, they are not revealing because they are children. But you see if Edwardian showgirls were wearing Belle Epoque costumes, obviously, and then the Mexican showgirls on the Revolution were wearing, folkloric costumes, and then the Bataclan showgirls were wearing, kind of cabaret costumes. What we understand as carnival, which I think we all know what it is, the very rebellion costume with the feathers and with the G string and all of that, has its origins here. We can see a more tropical take or Latin take on what Madame Racine was doing with the feathers. So let's take a look back at the history of Carnival just to make it more clear. So of course, Carnival it's not from Latin America. It has its origins in Rome, and it was like this crazy party with everyone will dress up. So here's what a carnival may or may not. Oh my god, I don't know what it says. 1960, it's 1650. Sorry, my bad. Let me correct that. So this is what a carnival would look in 1650. Okay, and of course this tradition was brought here to Latin America by I think it's going to say the wrong date in a couple of slides, sorry. It was brought to Latin America by the Spaniards, but also by the Portuguese in Brazil. So let's say that obviously this is the current festival in Vienna, I guess, or in Italy, where they all go masquerade. Obviously, I couldn't find a photo from 1840, but these may be what they look like because in 1840, if the Portuguese had installed in Brazil the carnival system, it was a French migration wave that arrived in the mid 19th century to Brazil, who brought all the idea of these fancy costumes into the incorporation of the carnival. So when it was carnival time in Brazil, the rich French would held masquerade balls near where the carnival parade was happening. So this is where really the Brazilian show costumes come from. So just keep that in mind. Of course, there is a lot of African influences. Um, it turns out that Brazil has a really strong history with slavery, obviously, and though enslaved Africans weren't free at the time, uh, during Carnival, the government let them participate on the parades. So of course, with the rich cultural background Africans have, they not only imposed a new idea of dressing, but of dancing, music, movement, feeling, and it was obviously incorporated into Carnival later on. Um, by the turn of the century, the daughter of the emperor of Brazil, or I guess she was dubbed as princess. I don't know if that's what you refer to her, and I don't know her name. Abolished slavery, and people from all social classes, from all races, could participate in the carnival. So this made the experience really culturally rich, and that's basically where the idea of the aesthetic that we have, of the big carnivals in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro comes from. So, simultaneously to the abolishment of slavery and the integration of all the uh, parts of society into the Carnival of Brazil, um, Americans in the United States were living the epitome of the age of Latin lovers. So, for instance, and many of you may not be familiar with it, in the 1920s and 30s, Hollywood was obsessed with the narrative of having, a cast of white people in their movies, and then having one exotic Latino who was extremely passionate and extremely erotic and extremely emotional, and who wore roses on her head, and who wore skimpy costumes, and who was dancing all the time. And so they brought a lot of Latin artists, like Ramon Novarro, Raquel Torres, who were Mexican ancestry, and then Anita Page, who I think is Venezuelan or from Panama, I don't remember. But they had tons and tons and tons of Latin characters, and they really created, an identity that was not true to it. Of course, they were seeing what was happening in the carnival, but the carnival it's a party. Of course, people are going to act over the top during the carnival, but that was not what everyday Latinos will behave like, and they included this narrative on their plots when they were, all going around and walking normally, and then the Latina character will start dancing tango out of nowhere. Um, La Cucaracha, which is the poster we have here, Um, La Cucaracha means the cockroach, for those who don't know, and it's also a corrido, a Mexican song. Was one of the first color films, and it's completely a complete elaboration of a fantasy of what Mexico could be. But it was about everything: Brazil, Argentina, Cuba. So, and they also mix a lot of stuff, and this is where a lot of the perception that still prevails from today, that Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Brazilians, Argentinians, even Spanish and sometimes Italians are the same. And I mean, we obviously have, shared characteristics because we all, the Latin culture is diverse, but at the same time has a lot of bridges that communicate and share culture between one another. But it's such a broad concept that you can just classify it as one. Of course there's a word Latinos, but we're completely different, and I think that the differences between each country should be appreciated. So for instance, even though this was all about being Latino, the biggest Latin star of this era was an Italian actor, Rodolfo Valentino, uh, who was, the epitome of the Latin lover, but was an Italian man, and there were a lot of, Spanish actors who were playing roles of Mexicans, and Mexicans playing roles of Argentinians, and Argentinians playing roles of Cubans, and it was just a mess. But the idea was to exaggerate it as much as possible. And um, when studying trends, what's happening right now, it's obviously going to affect the future. So just to put an example, a quick example, the fact that figures like Beyonce, or like Selena Quintanilla, and these women who broke the idea of Pamela Anderson, of a skinny that was prevailing in the 90s. The fact that they appear in the 2000s was obviously going to make that now we have the Kim Kardashians and the Nicki Minaj and all of that. It's a consequence of it. So if they were kind of curvier, they were just only going to get curvier. And so if these were Latinos and exaggerated, they could only get more Latino and more exaggerated. And that happened with Carmen Miranda.
Americaners tell me that my hat is high because I will not take it off to kiss a guy. But if I ever start to take it off, I do that once for Johnny Smith, and he is very happy with the lady in the tutti frutti hat.
So Carmen Miranda was, the epitome of Latinesque. But what I really like about her is that she was Portuguese, but she was a baby when she moved to Brazil, and she was raised in Brazilian culture, and she was and I mean she was a Brazilian. We were talking about the difference between Spanish and Mexicans and Latinos and Europeans, but of course there are some exceptions. You adapt to the culture that you grew up in. It's different to be, from Europe, but literally raised since baby in a Latin country, than to be European with no knowledge of what it means to be a Latin American and portraying those type of characters. So Carmen Miranda was the Brazilian showgirl, and she worked in Brazil, and she got the opportunity to move to Hollywood and work there. And instead of, I wouldn't call it appropriation, she did what I understand as reclamation. She said, there's a bunch of people um, making a party of us, and something that is not true to what we are, and they were presenting it to the masses as if Latin Americans were like that. Well, let me create my own narrative. And so if they wanted exaggerated, and if they wanted, over the top, Carmen Miranda gave that. and she was the first to wear, the fruits in the hair, the flowers, the shoulders with, ruffle, and all of that that translates to a Latin aesthetic that we understand better nowadays. So Carmen Miranda fulfilled all American fantasies about the Latina showgirls, and in doing so, transformed the concept of what it meant to be a showgirl in America. Her influence extends far beyond the world of cinema. She is equally appreciated in the world of fashion, music, and in the beauty industry. Carmen was unique indeed, but she was also a role model for the following generations of showgirls, Latinas or not. So basically, um, uh, Carmen, there's a before and after Carmen. Um, all the showgirls that were doing, the Orientalist thing, the Spanish thing, the folkloric Mexican thing, all of that stopped, and they were all now in the Latinesque aesthetic that Carmen was portraying, which talk, the languages of Brazil, of Cuba, of all these, more tropical, maybe Caribbean related subjects, and it was great because this is a construct. It was not taken from anywhere, because Brazilian showgirls were not dressing as exaggerated as she was dressing. She created this persona. She was like if Las Vegas, which no pun intended, created a show inspired by Latin showgirls. It's complicated, but I think you get the point. This is what after Carmen Miranda, this is what Brazilian showgirls started wearing. So we can see that the concept was, elevated, and of course it was more performative, if that's a word, more visual, more exotic, maybe more visually appealing, I would say. Um, Another fact that contributed to the showgirl aesthetic and idea was Prevision Era. So for those of you who don't know, Prevision Era, um, it was a time in the American history where clubs, bars, cabarets were shut down, and there was a constitutional ban on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. So Americans, being a consumption force, were not they were not either going to stay okay with it with this prohibition, and they were not going to either be how would I say, they were not going to innovate and create their own beer. That's no American mindset. They were going to buy it, and what they did, well, the ones who could, the ones near the border between Mexico and the United States, traveled to cities like Tijuana, Mexicali, which are in northern Mexico, but the ones in the east side went to Cuba. So since the 1920s, Cuba was a developing country with a lot of arts and entertainment happening in the scene. So, inspired by the French cabaret, multiple theaters and nightclubs started to appear in cities such as Havana. And because Americans couldn't have nightlife there, they traveled to Cuba to enjoy, the spectacle. So cabarets, theaters, casinos, nightclubs, resorts began to abound in the island of Cuba, and they all had unique shows and with showgirls, bands, and incredible costumes. Um, Here is where rumba, mambo, and cha 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 appear, and these are the basic rhythms of cabaret style, Latin cabaret style. So I love this story. So Americans love life in Cuba. Many of them even moved to Havana, and those who couldn't visited frequently. In Florida, there were those who took the ferry with their cars on Friday night, slept through the journey, and woke up in Havana on Saturday morning. They will spend a weekend in Cuba, and in Sunday morning, they will return, sleep in the whole trip away, and woke up in Miami at 7 a.m. and ready for work. So this was really happening. So um, obviously, Cuba didn't need Americans to develop, but the population of Cuba was really small. So the fact that uh, a lot of people from somewhere else were coming to Cuba, and they were not living there, so they were just going there to spend money. They were not earning anything. The Americans who went there was great for Cuban economy, and it helped to develop a new scene. Of course, clubs like the Tropicana Cabaret of Cuba, which also is a top-notch cabaret. I mean, the Tropicana is as famous as the Moulin Rouge as well. Um, Began to appear in all of Havana. So while the rest of Latin American countries had theaters, Cuba became the first to have an entire industry established from cabaret. Its growing nightlife scene made of Cuba the cradle of a lot of showgirls who, with their talent and beauty, managed to conquer not only the Cuban nightlife, but also the entertainment industry in Latin America. So, rumberas were born. And I make I like to highlight rumberas because rumberas are the epitome of the Latin showgirl movement. Carmen Miranda is a rumbera, but Carmen Miranda didn't work in Latin America. And being honest, Latinos didn't consume American cinema back in the day. So it was obviously they needed to create their own showgirls, and the rumberas appeared. So you have the names here. They are all Cuban, and they all work in Cuba, but also abroad. For example, Glamour Mora, who is here with the white bikini, she was an Afro-Latina, Afro-Cuban showgirl, and she worked in Europe. She did movies in Italy, in France. Olga Chaviano is also an Afro-Cuban showgirl, and she worked successfully here in Mexico and in the United States. Amelita Blanquita Amaro was Cuban, and she worked in Argentina, and the rest did movies here in Mexico. Amalia Aguilar worked in cabarets in the United States, and she literally was, sharing credits with the peers of Betty Page and figures like that are huge in the pinup imagery. So these women were really influential. And also another point to highlight is that during World War II, Americans put all their producing forces into the war, and so there was a period of time that how do I say it, that American cinema industry was not. Someone has its microphone on. I mean, I don't care, but it distracts me. Sorry. Um, there was a moment in time in history that um, the movies that were producing in Latin America were bigger than the ones they were producing in the United States, because United States lacked its cinema production. And I say it not to point out that they were better than the Americans, but without that competition, Latin showgirls became known worldwide. And these were real Latin American women doing Latin American rhythms, wearing clothes made by Latin American costume designers. So it was more representative than everything that we had previous to that. And just look at the costumes. I mean, they're eccentric, but they are realistic. It's not a caricature like the ones we were seeing prior. So all these Cuban ladies traveled the world, and they had really successful um, cinemas and films and movies, and it was incredible to see, Latin flavor being portrayed by Latin directors, by Latin musicians, by Latin designers, by Latin dancers, and they made it big in the United States as well. Here's a trailer for a movie called Aventurera with Cuban showgirl in Sevilla, and I just wanted to read the text that appear, and it was, this is how they promote the movie back in the day. Oh my God, why doesn't it play? Maybe I can show you guys the trailer like this.
hablando de ilusión y de pasión.
Hola, Lilita. Siéntate, tómate una copa con nosotros.
¡Desgraciado! ¿Qué le pasa a esta? ¿Se ha vuelto loca?
Las horas más felices de mi amor fueron contigo.
Regenerarte cometes una canallada digna de lo que eres. ¡Una cualquiera! Recuerda que tú fuiste quien me hizo una cualquiera. ¿De qué te extrañas entonces? Lo que más te duele es que tu hijo sufra, ¿verdad? Pues sábelo bien. Pienso ponerlo en el peor de los ridículos.
Por eso es que mi alma siempre está.
¡Mamá! ¡Te has vuelto loca!
Chiquita bacana, la da martinica. Si vesti con una casa di banana, nanica.
Chiquita bacana, la dama chica, si vesti come casca di banana.
So I wanted to show this because I mean it's obviously exaggerated because as I mentioned, you know, how operetta was for the lower classes or for the masses, and then revista was for the lower classes. Cabaret was obviously for the lower classes, and these type of movies were accessible for everybody. So it was, you know, it was not, you know, an artistic conceptual representation. It was not art cinema. It was, you know, dramas. It was, you know, musicals to appeal to most of the audiences. And another thing that I like to highlight from this trailer is, you know, how the old lady is super, you know, mean, and then she is like, she called her whore, and then the other guy is pulling her hair. These were obviously dramas, but the difference between these and the ones that were happening in the United States is that the Latina is not the only one crazy. You know, that's what was happening in the Mexican Spitfire and all these movies from the 1920s and 30s. Here, everyone, it's dramatic, but it's an understanding that they're, you know, it's the plot of the movie to be so dramatic, not that only highlight the Latin character as dramatic. So I wanted to include this sequence as well because here we can see for, you know, what the majority of the people who were watching Rumbera cinema and Rumbera's films were watching. And by watching this, we can see Brazilian, Cuban, Mexican, Argentinian. It's like almost like a compilation of showgirls from all the world represented in one. Well, I think that it's what it is, and they settle the standard for the next generations. Basically, I mean, you can see it may sound like the same, but it isn't. You can see the Spanish influence with the ruffles. You can see the black musicians who are, you know, obviously playing African Caribbean tunes. You can see, you know, the rhythm of the samba. You can see the rhythm of the mambo. So it's a mix, but it's a well done mix because it's made by Latinos, unlike what was happening in the United States. So the fact that the war was happening while these movies were being produced allowed the showgirls to be known outside of Latin America, and not just only in the United States. They were known in Europe, they were known in the Middle East. Most of them were hired to work overseas. And so it even though the other showgirls were great as well, the ones we saw in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, I think the ones from the 40s are the ones who set a precedent of what Latin showgirls will eventually become. Um, and of course, after the war, Hollywood adopted the idea totally. So, for instance, we have Betty Grable here in a segment of the movie Billy Rose's Diamond Horseshoe. She's singing Acapulco, and it has, she doesn't dance, and she does, all of these mixtures of cultures. But check it out.
You'll need some new huaraches when the mariachis start to play there. And after you depart, I know your crazy heart is gonna stay there. And if I haven't sold you with the things I've told you, then I must repeat it twice. That if you can't say Acapulco, then you can call it paradise.
And it happened with Marilyn Monroe and with tons of stars. Is that
a front of warm
this
air
kind
is
of
moving in from Jamaica. Moderately high barometric pressure will cover
for
the
instance,
northeast and the
Rita Hayworth was also, some kind of a character created like this. She was of Spanish ancestry, Spanish from Spain, not Hispanic, from Latin America. So they obviously built a character like this around her, and tons of other, famous actresses did stuff like this, but it was nothing near to what the showgirls were presenting, right? So what would I say that is the Latin American showgirl legacy? For instance, there are things as simple as the popularization of thongs and G-strings. For instance, the book Striptease, written by Rachel Sheard, said that the first performer to wear a G-string on stage was a Latina stripper Chiquita Garcia from California in 1934, and also Princess White Wing, a Latin American stripper near the end of the decade. I also like to include a lot of Native American performers, even though the ones who are from the United States or Canada don't identify as Latinos. I like to include them in everything I do. And just for everything that's happening in the fashion currently, Cardi B a couple days ago in the American Music Awards, I guess, or Billboard, wore these crazy headdress and feathered costumes. And of course, they are referencing showgirls, Kali Uchis with this
Si quiero hablar con ella, pero nunca me la voy a casar.
Rosalia, I've got, you have obviously seen designers include feathers, rhinestones, and fishnets, and all of these are pandering to the showgirl aesthetic, but many people don't know about it. So just to end, if you are interested in the topic and you want to extend your research and in showgirls, I recommend you to follow Photo Studio Luisita on Instagram and in every social media platform. This project is it started as a documentary that Sol Miraglia, who is an Argentinian director, did on Afro-Colombian photographer who worked in Argentina during the 1960s and 70s. And she digitalized 25 photos of Argentinian showgirls and the theater scene in general. And the documentary was released in 2018, I guess, but she still, promotes the archive through social media. And they are currently having an exhibition at the Museum of Latin America. This archive travel all over the world because it's incredible. I also would like to share with you guys the documentary Perdida by Viviana Garcia Besné. It's a documentary made in Mexico on the Mexican cinema scene, and it's subtitled in English, and it's free for everyone to see it. I will share the link at the end here in the chat, and it's one of the best documentaries I've seen, and it tells you the story of how the rumbera cinema started, because Viviana Garcia Besné is the niece of the producer of the rumberas films. Bellas de Noche, Beauties of the Night is also a documentary made here in Mexico by Maria Jose Cuevas. And this documentary is available on Netflix. And Maria Jose spent 10 years creating this documentary, 10 years between, the filming, the recovering of the archive, the editing. And she has an incredible archive of these 4 showgirls who are one Mexican of Native American ancestry, Rosie Mendoza, who is Jackie. Jackie is, a tribe here in Mexico. Lin May, who is also Mexican, but is of Chinese ancestry. Wanda Seux from Paraguay. Princesa Yamal from Argentina, and Olga Briskin. So, and they are all different type of showgirls. So this is a recommendation for sure. And she distributes some of the material through Instagram. So of course, go and contact her. She's also great. And of course, Ficheraz in all social media platforms with a Z. And that will be it from during my presentation. But I love to answer some of them if you're okay with that.
Wow, Rico, kudos for you. That was amazing. I think we're all very intrigued and very fascinated by all these stories you just shared with us. They're really amazing. I can't wait to go and watch all of those films, all of those documentaries. And I am sure there's questions among the public. So a couple of people have dropped questions already in the chat. I'm going to read them out loud for you to answer. And if someone else wants to ask anything, you can either drop a message in the chat and we're going to read it out loud. Or if you're feeling bold, you can always turn on your camera and your microphone and speak to Rico directly. So we have a question from Shasti, but I think you pretty much already answered it. It says, could Arturo suggest a watch list of films featuring iconic Latin American showgirls for us to watch, please? So I think that will probably be the list you just gave us, but if you have any more to recommend.
Yeah, so I mean, they did tons and tons of films, but I mean, if you don't know Spanish, it's hard to find them subtitled. But if you are willing, you can literally Google on YouTube the name of any of the showgirls I presented. For instance, Ninon Sevilla, and YouTube will give you, hundreds of her movies, because they are, not very legally uploaded there, but they're uploaded them since like 2008, 2005, from when YouTube started. So you can watch most of these movies because they are so old. They are almost anywhere in the internet, and I don't know if they're something with the copyright of them, but they're there, and there's not such thing of they taking it down. So just Google the name of them and of any showgirl, and you will see tons of.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rico. Now, this is not a question, but it's a comment from Jo Weldon. She says, there is a history of Plains Native Americans and Inuit wearing thongs called G-strings.
Yeah, the name G-string was originally, during the colonization of the United States, or I don't know what's the name of it, they called, some of the garments that the Native Americans were wearing G-strings. Of course, showgirls didn't invented them. If I say that, I didn't mean to. I meant that they popularized them as, garments for entertainment. But yeah, G-strings were originally worn by Native Americans.
Brilliant. Now, Zoe wants to know, She's asking, Rico, how did you start this research journey, and how long have you been doing it? For what have been the challenges you have faced on the way? Have you managed to obtain any funding to continue and preserve this archive? The scope is incredible. Thank you so much for such an insightful and colorful talk. So there's a few questions here.
Yeah, well, I just graduated from college. I'm 22 years old. And I started doing this research when I was still studying. And I have a regular job nowadays. I do public relationships. I sometimes write for different media platforms here and there. And literally, I do my research on my free time, which is, from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. And of course, I would like to profit from it. Not profit, but to have budget to maybe do a book, or to do a documentary on that. But from now on, I use the money of that I earn working to do this project. I mean, what else will I spend it? This is my passion, and I think it's really interesting to see how platforms like this festival and all the followers that I've gained, not for me but for the Showgirls, have interested in the project. So I don't think on obtaining any funding. I think, of course, I spend money on buying the old magazines, sometimes buying the movies, restoring them, but it's a pleasure for me to do it. And what are the challenges that I faced? The hardest challenge, and it may sound really, really sad, is that I didn't get to meet most of them. And of course, because they are, from older generations, most of them have passed away. Just recently, like 2 weeks ago, Amalia Aguilar, which is the showgirl we saw dancing on the film, passed away. She was like 97 years old. So of course, I will have liked to meet them. Of all the rumberas that I showed you guys, there's only one that's still alive, and that's Rosa Carmina. So help me look for her, because I think she lives in Spain, and she's obviously retired, and she's elder. But of course, I'd love to meet her. But I've met some of the from the 70s, from the 80s, but some of those have passed away too. Some of the photographers who portrayed them has passed away too. The documentary I presented you, Photo Studio Luisita's photo studio, Luis Escarria, the photographer, passed away last year as well. So just imagine if meeting one showgirl, the history she could tell you. Imagine the photographer who worked with all of them. So thank God, directors like the one Sol Miraglia who made the documentary recorded her and has this testimony of her life and work. But imagine how many of them have passed away who don't have this type of archive of their stories and their work. So I've been trying to meet most of them. That has been the biggest challenge. And I moved here to Mexico City when the COVID pandemic started, and of course, all of them being elders, they didn't want to meet anyone. So that was a challenge as well. But I've met a few of them, and they have told me incredible stories.
That must be incredibly challenging to find documentation of the work of some of these girls when you cannot interview them directly, for sure. Joe Weldon asks if you have done, or are you working on a book or documentary at the moment?
No, I haven't. I've done. I did a virtual exhibition for Google Arts and Culture. If you want, you guys, I can give you the link here in the chat as well. But no, I mean, I love to do a book. There are tons of photographers that are now forgotten, and they have the archive of the showgirls as if it was gold, and it is, but it's not valued by cultural institutions and nothing of that. And I've heard some stories of people taking advantage of them, and asking, I'm just going to use it for an exhibition, and then they publish the book, and the photographer gets nothing after, you know, preserving the negatives, the photos, the stories with them for, you know, over 40 or 50 years. So I would love to do a book, but it will have to be, you know, fair for all the people involved. And a documentary just recently, if you I don't know if it's okay if I share my screen again. Yeah. Just recently, I here's my screen. It's full of photos of the showgirls. Don't mind it. Um, I was watching this documentary on Teatro Maipo, the Maipo Theater, which is one of the most important theaters in Argentina for showgirls, and it literally tells the story of the theater, and but through the showgirls. And I love to do something like this.
Llegó a las dos Nélidas. Pasando por Josephine Baker y la Cochinelle hasta nada menos que...
I would love to do something like this, but you know, to make it more interesting about all the showgirls in Latin America, but that would be, you know, it will be a series or something like that. I'm really interested in something like that. You know, of course, you know, uh, directors of companies and big creatives have reached, even some directors who have experience with documentary and stuff like that have reached. And I've been thinking about collabing with them and doing stuff, but you know, this is not about me. And I don't want it to be about anyone else but to the showgirls. So every time they try to take, you know, advantage or change the narrative, I feel like I'm off. So I have to find a project that portrays them in the way I want the world to see them.
Rico, thank you for that. We officially finished the session at 6:30 London time, but we have a few more questions. So I don't know if you are rushing to go somewhere or if you're happy to finish answering the questions we have in the chat.
I'm happy to answer the questions.
Thank you. So where do you do most of your research? Asks Joe Wilden.
I've interviewed on the ones I cannot meet because they live in another country. I, you know, kind of creepy, but I stalk them until they answered. We have FaceTime, we have, you know, we can call via messenger, phone, anything. And that's how I've done some of the interviews, to many of them. And it has been very enlightening. I also buy a lot of books. There are tons of books who are, you know, old and who are really expensive and hard to find. And I found them, magazines, you know, meeting, you know, the different showgirls who are still around and telling them like my questions and getting, you know, their experience. So that's how I do my research. I'm not a professional researcher, by the way, so this is very experimental and with so little resources to find information, I try to do my best.
So it's a very, very impressive job considering that, but also your background is as a journalist. So you have a different approach to research than academia, but it's still valid and rich and incredible. Natalie wants to know if your curation exists anywhere of social media. Is it possible to see it in person?
No, not yet. For example, the Museum of Latin American Art in Argentina has, at the same time as the Showgirl exhibition, has one on queer identities. And as we saw in the presentation, some of the first who were allowed to play with gender roles were entertainers, of course, right? So they had an exhibition. They have an exhibition like that there. I was going to participate with them with some of my material. I was going to ship them to Argentina because I have tons of magazine of trans showgirls who were, you know, headlining shows alongside cis women back in the 1970s, which is incredible. But at the end, we didn't make it. We're currently working on something like that here in Mexico. I have tons of material that I would like to be included in the exhibition, but it wouldn't be about the Ficheraz archive, just, you know, some pieces from our archive. But I mean, I would love to someday have one of those, but you know, it's not. It sounds weird, but I don't do this for like me. I just want them to be, part of the history or stuff like that, or to be recognized as what they were, which is pioneers, trailblazers, revolutionary women, etc. So they're always trying to build, exhibitions on Showgirls because it's the anniversary of this theater, because it's the anniversary of this photographer, but it's never on the Showgirls themselves. So maybe I'll wait until the perfect time comes to do an exhibition on Showgirls without any other excuse, but just to.
Let's talk about it, Rico. Let's talk about it. Let's make it happen. And there's a lot of lovely messages from everyone saying, thank you so much. This is wonderful, says Portia. Victoria says, amazing, more please. It was amazing. Thank you so much. Love from Argentina. That's Luna. Roy asks, she says, thank you so much. Do you have a Venmo, PayPal, etc. for donations? I cannot believe this is free.
No, I don't have, but and I'm not planning on doing so. But a lot of the Showgirls, even though they were famous and beautiful and all that, their lives didn't end that well. So if you are, you have to pay attention to Ficheraz, because every time we need donations for them for surgeries, or because they have some kind of problem, we are always sitting there. So I don't take donations. I don't think I agree with that, because even though I put on a lot of work, it's all work of the photographers or the movie directors and all of them who should be credited for. I don't even put my name on Ficheraz, because I don't feel like taking on that notoriety. But every time the Showgirls need help, I help them as much as possible with my donations, and obviously giving them my platform for anyone. So please stay pay attention to Ficheraz, because I always put their bank accounts and stuff like that when they need some help, and the photographers as well.
Okay, thank you, Rico. Also, I would argue that even though you were not a photographer or a showgirl, the work you're doing is very exhaustive and very, very meticulous and very important. So, yeah.
But it's kind of like, for me, I mean, it should be paid, obviously, because there's people whose work is this. But for me, it's like a hobby, and I do it.
Well, you do your hobby amazingly well. I think we're all super impressed. Joe Weldon says, this was so wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to Wearers Fest. And Arturo Rico, this showgirl at heart sends lots of love and appreciation. Kelly sends a rose. Leticia says, so amazing. Thank you so much for taking your time to share all of your knowledge with us. Shasti says, I know Spanish. I know Shasti. I know she knows the Spanish. So I'm sure she's going to enjoy all the movies, the films you recommended.
So I'm going to write here in the chat the link to the documentary Perdida, which is the Rumbera Showgirl history documentary. It's in Spanish, but it has English subtitles, and I think it's free to access from all over the world. So there you go. And the other one, Bellas de Noche or Beauties of the Night, it's on Netflix, so everyone can see that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rico. Michelle says, hola from New York City. Such an incredible presentation. Gracias. The presentation was amazing, as others you have done. Coming here from Ficheraz and watching from Las Vegas. That's Natalie. Maya says, what's the name? I couldn't hear. I'm not sure to which name you're referring to. Maya, if you can specify, that would be great. I think Victoria probably answered that question. Google Ninon Sevilla Films. Yeah, she did answer that.
Yeah, that might be
it. Mercy asks if we're gonna have the recording of this session online, and we are gonna upload it in our YouTube channel, so stay tuned. We usually take a couple of days after the events to do this, but we will let you know through our Instagram. And So he says, you're so young and you have accomplished so much so far. Looking forward to seeing what you do with this work in the future and that you get to meet someone more of your icons. Hopefully you will write a book. Thank you from Ireland. Joe says it's so wonderful that you're honoring their legacy and keeping it alive. I see asks, hello, please, can I ask about showgirl hairdresses and why they adopted the use of the diamante? What is the origin of this, such as Carmen Miranda's turbans? If you can, if you have a quick answer for that, Rico.
Yeah, it's a quick answer. So the idea, the first showgirl headdresses are the ones, not like Carmen Miranda, but the ones who have like a metal structure, and then they are like, they have, the feathers at the top of it, kind of like a flower, like really thin, and then the feathers at the top. And those were initially invented, I don't want to say the wrong date, but mid 19th century, because there was a play where the showgirls were, showgirls always dressed as animals. They had the leopard cat suit. They had, like a poodle with the hairy ears and all that. And there was a play where they were kind of playing showgirl, the horses, and you know how royal horses have, this headpiece as well. So that's where the showgirl headpiece comes from, because they were once portraying kind of, regal horses, or I don't know how to say it, like a carousel horse. And so the headpiece stayed there. And the ones like Carmen Miranda, the reference, I think it's kind of obvious, to the African influence, the head wraps, of African women, women of African ancestry were not allowed to show their hair back in the colony because it was deemed as ugly. And so they were forced to wear turbans. So they, being creative individuals, said, okay, let me wear this turban, but let me add a lot of color, prints, feathers, everything. And so it was that's where the headdress come from. I don't know if that answered it.
Thank you so much, Rico. There is a message from Simon. It says, hello, there are 3 of us in this platform from the US, from the Western Massachusetts region. We are junior, senior students at university, and we have chosen this session for our intercultural group project. Amazing. First, we'd like to thank you. This presentation was so informative. Second is a question. Why did you choose Showgirls as a passion for research? Do you have plans for the future in terms of further research? A book? Who is your favorite showgirl? And what are some of your favorite costumes? So a few questions then.
Yeah, so I'm Mexican, but I had Cuban ancestry. My mother's side of the family is Cuban, and my grandmother is, a frustrated artist. She wanted to pursue a career as a singer, and she's a great singer, but she married, and it goes, especially for women in Mexico in the 1940s and 50s. So my uncle, one of her children, he was a musician when I was growing up, and we live in a state in Mexico called Veracruz, which is in the East Coast, and it has a lot of Caribbean migration, and it's the state with the biggest African ancestry population. And he worked in a lot of cabarets. He worked at the Carnival. We have also a Carnival in Veracruz, and he also, apart from being a singer, he was a musician. He played the bongos. He played for Celia Cruz, and he played for all these incredible artists that I grew up watching, because he took me with him to his events. And of course, in the Carnival, I was 4 years old, and he took me there, and there were the dancers with the feather headpieces and the costumes, the incredible bodies. And growing up, I started to be really interested in fashion, but also in art, but also in culture, but also in cinema. And so I had all these different passions, but the biggest one I have is beauty. And I like how the concept of beauty has transformed through the decades, and what represents that better than the showgirls. And I love showgirls because they're part of cinema history, music history, culture history, fashion history, beauty history, and I don't think I will ever change the topic of this research. I mean, I hope it evolves into something. Imagine the Museum of the Latin Showgirls somewhere. Imagine, something that great. But no, I think it's a theme. It's a subject that gives to study a lot, but because you can study it from different perspectives. We're right now studying fashion, but we can talk about race. We can talk about politics. We can talk about sex. We can talk about gender. So it's a really broad topic, and that's why I love it. So I hope I answered your questions.
Thank you so much, Rico. I'm afraid that now we do have to go. Mainly, most of the comments we have left are lovely messages saying thank you so much for your presentation, and yeah, just how amazing your job and your research is. And I want to thank you in the name of the whole team of wearers for being so generous about your knowledge and for sharing with us this amazing research you've done. I think we're all leaving very, very inspired and wanting to know more and wanting to go and research more and watch all those films you recommended. This has been incredible. I think it's been like the perfect way for us to wrap up the year at Wearers Festival. And yeah, it was just like amazing having you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, let's collab again. I loved it, and I mean, I'm not an expert in fashion as you girls are, but I try my best, and I think it's a really interesting.
Either. we're just passionate about it, but we're not experts either.
No, it's great, and I think it's
yeah, definitely not
that we can all explore, because we all like to dress up, and it gives part of our identity as countries, as individuals. So I love it.
Absolutely. And also thank you so much for all of you who joined us today, and those of you, especially those of you who stayed with us until the very last of the conversation, and to those of you who participated and asked questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to read all of them, but we're very happy to save the chat and send the questions to Rico if he wants to have a look to them and maybe answer you individually if he has time.
Before leaving, I would like to to the ones who stay to this moment. The history of Showgirls is really broad, and of course I love the ones who were in movies, and the ones who dated celebrities, and the ones who all of that. But I recommend you guys, because there is a showgirl in every town. Look for the history of entertainment in your town and find your local showgirl. From back in the day, they may be your neighborhood that your neighbor who you don't know. Ladies, the showgirls I met here in Mexico City don't look like superstars nowadays, but they used to. So, to have them, seeing someone who is interested in their life and their career will make their life, worth it. Because yes, sometimes we can see the burlesque industry and the cinema industry, especially the old cinema industry, as misogynist, as exploitative, and all of that. But most of the showgirls who are involved are still around, and for them, that's their life. So just shine light in in their lives, because they appreciate it a lot. Check where the cabarets back in the day, your town, the bars, the nightclubs, and I'm sure you'll find a singer, a dancer, a musician who is there waiting for someone to know the stories of their life.
That's an amazing conclusion. I think we all have new appreciation for the work of the Showgirls. And just to finish, there's this lovely comment from Luna for you. It says, in the name of all Argentinian Showgirls, I thank you and must tell you that we all dream to be in your research someday, making history. We love you so much. Thank you so much, Rico.
Nos vemos.
Thank you so
Adiós.
much.
Lovely to see you. Take care all.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.